Hello, ladies and gentlemen. This is John Literal, host of JohnLiteral.com. Today is February the 13th, 2024. This is part 5 of the video series that I'm doing on the Illuminati's plan to abolish all religion. And so this video I'm going to talk about the Cabal and their workings through the Protestant Reformers. I'm going to talk about the three main branches of the Protestant Reformation and how it had been used to push this New World Order agenda and actually to abolish all religion. See, the Protestant Reformers had a common enemy as the Cabal, and that's the Catholic Church. And so in part 1, I talked about how the Catholic Church came to be, how Christianity had been infiltrated by this cult, and how Christianity became institutionalized. And that was not a good thing. It became the main power structure behind the control of the world, and the cult used it. Then, after a number of centuries being the main source of the power structure, the cult realized that they were going to have to start making some changes and go from an old world order, go from the old way of the way they controlled the world into a new world order. And so they knew that one of the things, in order to abolish the old world order, they were going to have to get the Catholic Church out of the way. And if they could not completely destroy it, they figured out that they were going to have to at least infiltrate it and co-opt it. So they were behind the creation of some secret societies after the end of the first millennium. And so in part 2, I talked about the Templars and the Jesuits. I did kind of gloss over a couple other secret societies, such as the Rosicrucians and Freemasonry. And in part 3, I talked about the Sabbatean Frankists and their part that they played in bringing in actually the Bavarian Illuminati. Jacob Frank, who was part of this Sabbatean Frankism, he aligned with Adam Weishaupt and Mary Amstel Rothschild to create the Bavarian Illuminati. And they kind of sealed the deal for ushering in the New World Order. And then part 4, I talked about the papacy and the Vatican and how the Illuminati has, like I said, the Illuminati actually planned to just completely destroy Catholicism. They wanted to completely destroy the papacy and the Vatican, just completely wipe it out. But they realized over time that the best way to go about it was to infiltrate it and co-opt it, and that they did. And so that's what I talked about in part 4. So in this part 5, I want to talk about the three main branches of the Protestant Reformation. And that's Lutheranism, Martin Luther, then John Calvin, and then the Church of England. And so we'll talk about that. And so, after almost 1,000 years of decline, the shackles of the Dark Ages were finally broken with the arrival of the Renaissance on the European scene. And so, the return of interest in art and science and literature all came about. And, of course, the Protestant Reformation. And, in the years that followed, millions of people assumed that the Reformation was just a religious movement. The picture of thousands of sincere, fully dedicated people all over Europe fighting bravely and devoutly to return to the faith. and what they believed was the faith that was delivered to the saints. That verse comes from Jude 3. But that's what they, a lot of them intended on, but it became rather a lot of dark things happened, and so, it is true that religion was only one of the many factors involved in the Reformation, but there were other components, which included things like politics and financial reasons, and and also intellectual aspects. And after many hundreds of years of political and religious oppression and high taxes and a strong wave of nationalism that swept all over Europe, and with it came the desire of many to free themselves from the dictates of the church, as well as the desire to manage their own affairs. And so many reformers used religion as a cover for the expansion of their political ambitions. So let's take a look at Martin Luther. Initially, many reformers were mainly interested in dealing with the monstrous corruptions that were rampant in the Roman Catholic Church. And Martin Luther, he actually remained in the church for several years, even after his 49 Theses that he hung on the door of the castle in Wittenberg. Now, among other things, he condemned the sale of indulgences, and the revenue, from which the huge St. Peter's Basilica in Rome was built on. Now, Lawrence Gardner wrote a book called The Bloodline of the Holy Grail, and I'm going to read what some of the details he shares about this. He says, quote, during the early years of this persecution, the Dominican monk Johann Tetzel institutionalized a lucrative scheme to replenish the Vatican coffers. The scheme concerned the forgiveness of sins, which had generally been atoned by means of penances such as fasting, repetition of the rosary, and other acts of sincere repentance. Now, Tetzel's concept replaced these traditional penalties with indulgences, former declarations of guaranteed absolution, which were available for cash, as this was mentioned in the Canterbury Tales, and compiled which was compiled in the late 1380s. Now, approved by papal decree, the sale of indulgences soon became a source of considerable revenue for the church. For centuries, the Orthodox clergy and its associated monastic orders had suffered a series of outrageous measures imposed by an greedy hierarchy that was becoming ever more corrupt. Through it all, they had nonetheless upheld successive Vatican dictates with as much loyalty as they could muster, but the trading of Christian salvation for money was more than some could tolerate. You think? The practice, therefore, was openly challenged. In October of 1517, an Augustinian monk and professor of theology at the University of Wittenberg, Germany, nailed his written protest to the door of his local church, an act of formal objection that was destined to split the Western Church permanently in two. When he received a papal reprimand, he publicly set fire to it and was excommunicated for his pains. His name was Martin Luther, and his fellow protesters became known as Protestants. That's in a quote by Lawrence Gardner from his book, Bloodline of the Holy Grail. The Reformation inspired the increased interest of the common man in the knowledge of the Bible. As the revival of literature made the contents of the New Testament known, it became clear that what was labeled Christianity at the end of the 15th century, when compared to what we know of Christianity at the end of the apostolic age. It became unrecognizable. And, Christian nations no longer looked up to the holy and living God, but found refuge in everything that a superstitious, frightened, and alarmed imagination could devise. Excuse me for a second. Martin Luther often referred, he's often referred to as the father of the Protestant Reformation. But, he himself, as I mentioned in the last video, was a Rosicrucian practitioner of Kabbalism. And some believe that the Protestantism itself was a creation of Rosicrucian agents. Martin Luther's personal notebooks are adorned with the rose and the cross. And, it was by no chance that Martin Luther's protests gained support in some very influential circles. For Rome had many enemies in high places. Not the least of these enemies were the Knights Templars and, the underground Hermetic societies whose esoteric crafts had been condemned by the Catholic Inquisition. The truth was not so much that Luther gained the support of others, but that, he was the willing instrument of an already active movement which attempted to dismantle the rigid international domination of the Pope. So let's take a look at John Calvin and Calvinism. This is another branch of the Protestant Reformation. The Christian church was split into rival and violent factions by the Rosicrucian Martin Luther. So, the emergence of a brand of the Protestant faith called Calvinism, which was later known as the Puritans, came about, and its founder was John Calvin. But he's from France. His name was actually Jean Calme from Noyens, France, and he was educated at the Brotherhood-controlled College de Montaigu. This was also where Ignatius Loyola, the Catholic founder of the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, that's where he was educated to as well. And so, I talked about Ignatius Loyola in one of my, I think it's part 2. And so, he actually was part of a Spanish version of the Illuminati, the Illuminados. So that kind of, you see a connection here where they were schooled at. And so Calvin at the time, was Calme was his real last name. He moved to Paris, and then he moved to Geneva, Switzerland, where he was known as Cohen. Changed his name. This name relates to, quote, the term priest, and it goes back to the Egyptian mystery schools. It's so you see his connections with the occult. Now in Geneva, he developed, or someone else did, the philosophy known as Calvinism, and he changed his name again from Cohen to Calvin to make it more acceptable to the English, who were now, became the prime target of this new religion. Yet, another created by the same source as all the others. So Calvinism was a designer religion for the next stage of the plan. It focused rigidly on the 10 Commandments of Moses and the Old Testament text, taken literally, not symbolically. But, this was the crucial bit. Up to this point, the Christian religion had banned usury, the charging of interest on loans. But now, with the black nobility bankers maneuvering to take over England, which was a Christian country, using the outwardly Christian aristocracy, the time had come to an end that, rule and to make usury the norm. So Calvinism, supported the charging of interest, and one of the great beneficiaries was Switzerland, where the plot was conceived, because, it became the center of the world's private banking system. And, when you look at Switzerland today, that's where they have, in Davos, they have the meetings for their one world government meetings for the World Economic Forum, and St. Klaus Schwab. So you can see where all this kind of stuff originates from. Another role for Calvinism was to insist on the burning of witches, and so in doing so, uh, to take more of the secret knowledge out of the public circulation. That's what that was done for. And the black nobility wanted their man, William of Orange, on the throne. And to do this, they had to remove Charles I, the guy that they eventually beheaded in 1649. Calvinism was used to ferment unrest with the monarchy. That's all about divide and conquer. And, the Protestant Reformation definitely caused a lot of division all over the world. And it still does. When you look at the over 40,000 Christian denominations today, supposedly all using the same book, I mean, it's the ultimate of divide and conquer. Let's take a look at the Church of England. This is the third branch of the Protestant Reformation. And this is, there's a lot that came from the Church of England. And actually, in this video, I'm not going to go into all the different denominations and how, they've been infiltrated and how a lot of them is controlled by Freemasonry. A lot of them were started by Freemasonry, going into the revival period, going into the 1700s, like, people like John Wesley, who was basically the founder of the Methodist Church. I'm not going to go into all those different these three branches end up branching into, thousands of denominations. So, not going to go into that in this video, but just going to focus in on these three. But I'm going to kind of elaborate on the different forms of the Church of England. The Anglican Church and the Episcopalian. Those are part of the Church of England. They just have variant names. But, the Protestant Church came to England because, the old story of King Henry the VIII. He wanted a son and an heir with his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. Had produced, she only had, together they only produced a daughter. So, he wanted to divorce her and, try his luck elsewhere. But Pope Clement VII refused to sanction this. And, Henry at this time was a committed Catholic, at least, in public. And the Pope had awarded him the title, get this, the Defender of the Faith. Ironically, the same title awarded by a Roman Catholic Pope is still held by the British monarchs to this day to defend the Protestant faith. You just got to laugh at all this. Yeah, it's just a big charade. Now, Henry, being much displeased by the Pope's refusal to sanction his divorce, ordered Parliament to create a Church of England, independent of Rome. He made himself the head of the new church in the Act of Supremacy of 1534 and unleashed a bloody purge against Roman Catholics. And Henry was succeeded by his only son, Edward. But, Edward died at the age of 15, and then he was replaced by Henry's daughter, Mary. And she was a staunch Roman Catholic who earned the title Bloody Mary for her purge of Protestants. Isn't that nice? Now, Mary had secured the throne by executing her rival, Lady Jane Grey, the Six-Day Queen. And with Mary's death came the legendary reign of Elizabeth I, which was Henry's daughter by Anne Boleyn. And Elizabeth executed her rival, Mary, Queen of Scots, from the House of Stuart. And Elizabeth proceeded to restore the Church of England with herself as the supreme head. And she ordered a purge against Catholics, which was to earn her the title Bloody Elizabeth. So, boy, ain't that real Christ-like. The Church of England, also known as the Anglican Church in Canada, and the Episcopalian, or, also it's called Protestant Episcopalian Church in the United States, is now part of the one world religion. There are a few conservatives who are still holding out, but, they appear to pose little threat to the power structure and, can be ignored by the Masonic hierarchy that controls the churches. It must be difficult at best for the conservatives. These conservatives are placed repeatedly in positions where they must compromise with the direction the church is going. And, several items that they are involved in. One, the Anglican and the Episcopal churches are run by the Masons. Two, these churches are now supporting the New Age movement. And three, the Anglican Church has been closely associated with the distorted form of British Zionism, Israelism. Now, the Anglican Church is also very close to Masonry. And the Anglican and the Episcopal churches are really extensions of Freemasonry. One scholar on Freemasonry describes the Church of England as paralyzed against Freemasonry. Church officials, Anglicans and Presbyterians, have lost their jobs because they criticize Freemasonry. So, it's something, that in 1987, the Masons ruling the Church of England allowed a group of Anglican priests called the Working Group, established by the Standing Committee of the General Synod of the Church of England, to publish a report questioning the compatibility of Freemasonry and the Church. And the report said that, quote, points to a number of very fundamental reasons to question the compatibility of Freemasonry with Christianity, end quote. So, even though this is a step in the right direction, the report poses absolutely no threat to the Masonic power structure. Some of the top leaders of the New Age have come out of the Episcopal Church, and now in their pulpits, some of the most anti-Christian and some of the most perverted people are preaching in the pulpit. For example, of the extent of Freemasonry within the Anglican Church can be seen in, there's an article by the London's Daily Express which lists the number of Masons in the highest Anglican offices in 1960. In 1960 there were within the Anglican Church 13 Mason Anglican bishops, including one Canadian and 6 retired. The Archbishop of Canterbury and the Archbishop of the West Indies were both Freemasons. Also, there were 6 deans and provosts of cathedrals and 10 archdeacons who were Masons. It's amazing that so many men have dedicated their lives to the Masonic institution, really. Just keep in mind that these men are, as they are initiated into, in the lodge, they were told in the ceremony, this is what they're told, quote, no institution can boast more solid foundation than that of which Freemasonry rests, the practice of every moral and social virtue, end quote. Yet, the Bible declares that, for no other foundation could be laid except which is Christ Jesus. So we see the denial of Christianity. It's no surprise that considering the Episcopalian support for the Masonic world religion and a one world government, that 33rd degree Freemason George Bush, Daddy Bush, who had hoped to, be the one in office to have the honors of bringing in the New World Order, would, as U.S. President, he would turn to such men as Edmund Browning, presiding bishop of the Episcopalian Church in the United States. Another reverend that Bush turned to during the Kuwait crisis was the Senate chaplain, Reverend Charles C. Halverston. So Illuminati agent, Skull and Bones member George Bush. He was all part of this Episcopalian church. The Episcopalian church is officially part of the one world religion. A foreshadowing of the union of the large power religions of Christendom was seen in 1922 when the Greek Orthodox Church, specifically the Eastern Orthodoxy Holy Synod of Constantinople, accepted the Anglican religious orders. And, Archbishop of Canterbury committed the Church of England to the pact that the global forum of spiritual and parliamentary leaders on human survival decreed. The pact resulted in a 5-day global forum where religious leaders of all persuasions, were present there. Also participating were the Archbishop of Canterbury, the normal host of Mason religious and spiritual leaders, U.S. senators, Soviet government officials, the United Nations Secretary General, the Dalai Lama, and a host of other types of like monks and Muslims and rabbis. They declared their commitment to the unified religion. This is ecumenism that I talked about, how the papacy got involved in this. And so, in January 15th through the 19th in 1990, they held another global forum in Moscow, Russia, USSR, when it was under Soviet control. The global forum called for a new planetary perspective involving a new spiritual and ethical basis for human activities on Earth. So, they're just proposing a new ethical basis for us to replace the old-time religion. So many Christians, have stood for all this time. And theirs is the revitalized Christianity, also known as the Masonic religion, that New Age leaders such as Bailey and Benjamin Creme say will be the one world religion. It is the religion of Masonry, which is described by Albert Pike when he said, quote, "Masonry, around whose altars the Christian, the Hebrew, the Muslim, the Branham, the followers of Confucius and Zoroaster can assemble as brethren and unite in prayer to the one God." End of quote by Albert Pike. So, the Anglican Church is not being destroyed, but rather subverted, just like the Catholic Church. And, just as it was made to bow to the dictates of Henry VIII, it is bowing to the dictates of the international power, which plans to rule the world. And so, there you go. That's sad. Now, it doesn't mean that every Protestant is all part of the New World Order, but, I think it's important for all of us, if you are a Christian, to, and whatever church you're affiliated with, I think it's important to pay attention what their affiliations are. Because, you could be supporting a church that's supporting the New World Order, supporting the Illuminati, which means that you're supporting the enemies of God. And so anyway, I'll go ahead and end the video here. I appreciate you all. Take care. Have a good day.